Labor versus capital was the major conflict in the second half of the 19th century. Growing hatred of the robber barons and the violence perpetrated against the growing labor movement set the stage for an anarchist to attempt to assassinate one of the most powerful businessmen in the United States. But the assassination attempt wouldn't go quite as planned. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and with me is my lovely co-host slash wife, the unqualified, unapologetic Kimberly. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at Alexander Berkman's attempt to assassinate Henry Frick and the Homestead strike that proved to be the catalyst of this event. So, Kim, are you ready to take a look at robber barons and radicals of the late 1800s?
I'm ready. Nothing says date night like violent labor disputes and a little light attempted murder. I'm dying to talk about men who wear top hats while crushing workers' souls.
The Gilded Age was a time of massive unrest in the country. Labor and robber barons found themselves at times engaged in open warfare. Workers wanted what they saw as their fair share of profits, and management want to maximize those profits for themselves and shareholders. To aid them in the industrialists were able to use private armies to hold off strikers. The most famous being the Pinkertons, who actually outnumbered the U.S. Army between 1870 and 1890. And if that didn't work, they could almost always rely on friendly governors to call in the militia, or even the president to call in the U.S. Army. Under these circumstances, the wealthy, powerful members of the Gilded Age elite might feel untouchable. At the top of the economic ladders were the likes of Andrew Carnegie and John David Rockefeller, but just below these were the other titans like Vanderbilt and Morgan. Below them, there were the second level mega rich, men whose fortunes were closely tied to the smaller handful of oligarchs who owned the country. It was John Jay, the nation's first Supreme Court Chief Justice, among other important roles he played, who said, "Those who own the country ought to govern it." But this idea might have never been more true than in the Gilded Age. Among those with the wealth who they believed allowed them to run the country was Henry Frick, Carnegie's second in command. Frick had quite a different upbringing than his boss, Andrew Carnegie. Where Carnegie had come up his way as an immigrant laborer, Frick was the product of a family with ties to the wealthy and powerful. At 21, he and two cousins started a business producing coke for the steel mills in Pennsylvania, more accurately, paying others to produce it. It was around this time that he first met Andrew Carnegie, but the two wouldn't go into business together for several years. With a loan from his wealthy friend Andrew Mellon, a multimillionaire who would later serve as Secretary of the Treasury, he was able to buy out his cousins, and by 1880, he controlled 80% of the coal production in Pennsylvania.
Wow, what a heartwarming, rich to even richer story. Skip the hard work, cash in your family name, borrow millions from your millionaire family, and boom, you own most of the Pennsylvania's coal. Really makes me feel bad for all the billionaires today who had to settle for just inheriting their fortunes. Really inspiring stuff for the rest of us who were thrilled when we got a JCPenney's charge card.
On the 15th of December, 1881, Frick married Adelaide Howard Childs. She was the daughter of a powerful manufacturing family in Pittsburgh. Her father had died in 1878, but left his widow and children with an outstanding financial position. She was the perfect wife for a businessman on the rise, helping to expand his vast connections. But nothing could stand in the way of business. While on his honeymoon, the couple ran into Andrew Carnegie. Frick had become a major supplier of fuel for Carnegie's growing steel empire, and he had little trouble convincing Carnegie that a partnership would serve the two tycoons very well. The two joined forces and basically controlled all steel and coal in Pennsylvania. In addition, Carnegie's other holdings controlled almost half of all steel production in the United States. These two alone controlled a significant percentage of the U.S. gross domestic product. Their workers, on the other hand, made less than the equivalent of today's minimum wage. Carnegie was starting to spend more time with his various philanthropic endeavors. He was starting to fund education and building numerous libraries. Then, of course, there was his great gift to the city of New York, Carnegie Hall. It seemed that he was wanting to do what he could to improve society. It might have been more effective to pay his workers a livable wage and not overprice their rent and food in company stores, but that would look bad to investors. With Andrew spending more time in these other areas, he would need someone he trusted to handle more of the business. Frick would be that man. He became the chairman of Carnegie Steel.
Nothing says improving society like building libraries for the public while making sure your workers don't have time to read them. But hey, at least Carnegie Hall has great acoustics for the sound of corporate hypocrisy.
While Carnegie was far from pro union, he did view himself as a supporter of the working man, just not enough to pay a livable wage. He had worked in the factory as a young man in the early years of the American Industrial Revolution. From his experience, he believed that workers could individually bargain with companies, leaving no need for unions. It must be fair to point out here that Carnegie worked in factories was brief and really predated the mega factories with thousands of workers like the ones he and Frick owned. With just a handful of workers, management and the workers were more likely to see each other as teammates working for a common goal. In these massive factories where workers became more like pieces of machinery, he was also lucky to get promoted off the sweatshop floor very quickly and was completely out of the factories within 2 years. But he still at least presented like he had an affinity for the working man. Frick, on the other hand, showed a complete contempt for the average laborer and took a staunch anti union stand. Frick's attitude towards labor was well known. He resisted any attempts to raise wages. Safety improvements were only implemented if Frick felt they were absolutely necessary, always placing profit above people.
Ooh, Frick, he's my hero. What an inspiration. If I were in greed, ignoring safety and squeezing every penny out of my workers.
So in 1892, when Frick unveiled his plan to break the union that had been growing at the Carnegie Steel Mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, Carnegie felt it was best to take a trip to his homeland of Scotland. After all, who wouldn't rather play golf and dine with aristocrats than witness a prolonged battle between workers and management? Later, Carnegie would deny having approved Frick's actions, but the messages between him and Frick make it clear that he gave him his full support. Being out of the country wouldn't fully absolve Carnegie. In the position to do as he pleased, Frick planned to break the union was simple: cut the workers' pay to an unacceptable level. If the workers accepted the pay cut, then he won by proving the union couldn't protect them. At the same time, an unskilled worker in the mills was paid $1.70 per 12-hour day, around $60 today, and skilled laborers made between $4 and $7.60 per day, equivalent to 140 to 266 per day. In addition, about 30% of their pay went back to the company in the form of rent for the shacks they were forced to live in the mill towns. Forced to shop in mill owned stores where they found high prices, they would oftentimes have to borrow against future earnings in order to make ends meet. Like the old song says, you load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. Thank you, Merle Travis. That song, of course, made more famous by Tennessee Ernie Ford. This was dangerous work also. With molten steel, death was not uncommon in the mills. On average, it was said that 2 to 4 workers died in Carnegie Mills each week.
Wow, it's a lot.
That's insane. If the workers rejected the pay cut, and went on strike, he would have the chance to break the union. For their part, the workers played into Frick's hands by rejecting the pay cut, not as if they had much choice. Then he locked the workers out of the mill and erected a 3-mile long, 12-foot high fence around the mill, topped with barbed wire and complete with gun ports. He then secretly hired Pinkertons to protect strike breakers he was planning on having shipped to Homestead. Scabs, brought in to break the strike, oftentimes had no idea where they were going and were unaware of the circumstances they were about to walk into.
Frick's master plan: cut pay, track workers like sardines, build a fortress, and sprinkle in some clueless scabs for fun. Truly a visionary, if your idea of leadership is terror.
3,800 workers, only 750, mostly skilled laborers, were members of the union. They met at the Homestead Opera House and voted overwhelmingly to strike. Workers moved to occupy the mill, and a committee took control of the town. The sheriff, unable to gather a posse to oppose the strikers, allowed them to take the town. With workers in possession of the mill, strikebreakers could not be brought in to replace them. Over 1,000 strikers marched as pickets along the 10 miles shore of the Monongahela River. On the night of the 5th of July, 1892, 300 Pinkertons boarded barges and started to move the 5 miles downriver to the mill that was now in possession of 10,000 strikers and their sympathizers. Reaching the mill, the Pinkerton agents attempted to come ashore. Workers warned the agents not to leave the barges. When a gangplank was lowered to the shore, a striking worker set across the gangplank, blocking the agents. An agent came forward and ordered the man to move, but he refused. When the agent attempted to force the worker off the gangplank, he pulled out a pistol and shot the agent in the leg. This sparked a gun battle that would force the Pinkertons to retreat. Unfortunately, the retreating agents were met with a hail of bullets from all sides and had to surrender. Once taken into custody by the workers, the agents were beaten, and 7 strikers and 5 agents were dead.
Well, that escalated quickly from sit from a sit-in to a full-blown bloodbath. Pretty much the 1890s in a nutshell.
For the next few days, the striking workers and their supporters controlled the town and the mill. The victory by the strikers would be short lived, though. Union leaders wanted to avoid more bloodshed and got word to Frick that they wanted to meet. Frick refused to meet with the Union. On the 7th of July, the labor leaders also sent word to the governor that law and order had been restored in the town. Governor Robert Patterson relied that he had heard differently. Union leaders then met with the governor in person. However, the governor seemed much more concerned with the safety of Carnegie property than human life. Patterson, who had relied on Carnegie money to get elected, now saw little choice but to call in the state militia. This was the common course of action during the large strikes. Government was solidly on the side of industry. Even the courts were the domain of the wealthy ruling class. In what seems like a weird twist, the courts used the 14th Amendment, intended to give all persons equal protection under the law, to criminalize many of the actions of labor. The concept of personhood of corporations, I get mad at that too, dog. The concept of personhood of corporations was not new, dating back to 1819 and the Dartmouth case. But it was on steroids in the late 1800s. Collective bargaining, labor, and wages were all said to deny corporations of their due process rights, which were guaranteed to, quote, any person, unquote, under the 14th Amendment. So the government, siding with Frick, was no surprise.
14th Amendment, brought to you by the people who looked at equal protection under the law and thought, perfect, let's use it to protect corporations from paying fair wages.
Strikers knew the militia was coming. They hoped by meeting the arriving military force with open arms, they could win favor, avoiding armed conflict. But the militia's timetable was kept secret, and they disembarked outside of town instead of at the train station downtown. On the 12th of July, 4,000 militia surrounded the mill. Their commander made it clear they were there to support the interest of Carnegie Steel. Within 20 minutes of the mill being surrounded, the strikers left Carnegie property. Meanwhile, in a small ice cream shop in New York, Emma Goldman and her lover, Alexander Berkman, whom she called Sasha, followed the news of the Homestead strike. The two anarchists saw Frick as having launched an attack on the working man and had to be held accountable. Goldman, who would write in her autobiography, Living My Life, said, quote, "To us it sounded the awakening of the American worker, the long-awaited day of his resurrection. The toiler had risen, and he was beginning to feel his mighty strength. He was determined to break the chains that held him in bondage for so long."
Nothing says down with the system like plotting revolution over a double scoop of chocolate chip mint.
Yeah, the anarchist who owned an ice cream shop. Something about that seems either really fitting or just really weird. I'm not sure. When word came down that Frick had evicted the wives and children of striking workers from their company housing, the couple decided they had to go to Homestead and lend their support to the working men struggling against their oppressor. Their support primarily took the form of writing pamphlets for the strikers. In reality, the idea of overthrowing the wage system in order to usher in the golden age of anarchy and socialism was probably too extreme for the average steel mill worker, but they were happy for any support they could get.
Frick again, my hero, obviously. And nothing says revolution like changing their world with a well written pamphlet, because clearly that terrifies billionaires more than bullets ever could.
Berkman had become convinced, and maybe rightfully so, that all the violence could be blamed on Frick, stating, "Frick is the responsible factor in this crime. He must be made to stand the consequences." The anarchists believed that killing Frick would not only avenge the fallen workers, but also embolden the workers to rise up against their corporate oppressors. It would further strike fear into the hearts of the ruling class, forcing them to give in to the demands of the poor. Confidently, Berkman pronounced, "I will kill Frick," he continued. "I will die proudly in the assurance that I gave my life for the people." For a man who was commanding forces in the middle of a violent standoff, Frick was surprisingly easy to get to. It seems he didn't have bodyguards, and maybe didn't even bother to lock his doors. Berkman traveled to Pittsburgh and had no trouble just walking into the office of the multimillionaire, carrying with him a pistol and a sharpened steel file. I guess it was easier to get a gun in 1892 than a knife. It took little time for Frick to realize that the stranger was not there for business. He tried to get out of his chair. Before he could get to his feet, Berkman pulled a revolver and fired twice. The first bullet struck Frick in the ear, passing through his neck and coming to rest in his back. The second bullet also struck him in the neck, causing a large amount of bleeding. The shots knocked Frick back into his chair. John George Alexander Leachman, king of unnecessarily long names, and VP of Carnegie Steel, grabbed Berkman's arm, preventing him from firing a third time. Frick, at this point, though bleeding like a man shot twice in the neck, got to his feet, likely with Leachman's help, and tackled Berkman. As the three men rolled around on the floor, Berkman got to the file and stabbed Frick 4 times in the leg before he was subdued by other workers who burst into the room.
Oh, Frick, what a hero. No bodyguards, no locked doors, just casually waiting to get shot and stabbed like it's just a Tuesday. Truly inspiring. If your goal is to test the limits of bad luck, genius move. Truly the how to almost get killed masterclass of 1892.
Now, Frick was a robber baron and an all around jerk, but to get shot twice in the neck, then tackle your would be assassin is pretty badass. He was treated on the scene by a company doctor. In the 1890s, this might have actually been better than going to a real hospital. He reportedly even wrote his mother that night, casually mentioning the attack, quote, was shot twice today, unquote. Give me no more details than that. He was back to work full time in less than a week. Remember, though, the Gilded Age had no sick leave, but then again, he was already a millionaire. Berkman had no real legal defense and was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. He would serve 14 and use the experience to write his first book, Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist. But his attempted assassination would have the opposite effect he had hoped for. Frick, who had been demonized in the press, now became a sympathetic victim. Public support for the strike waned, and with the protection of 2,000 militia positioned on the high ground above the town, Frick was able to bring in scabs to work the mill. In addition, other Carnegie mills were able to offset any lost production by the striking Homestead workers. After 4 months, the workers ran out of provisions and had to agree to return to work at reduced pay. Frick had effectively broken the union.
Frick, once again, proving he's my hero, playing victim in the press, calling in the militia, and breaking a union while sipping his morning coffee.
In the aftermath, union leaders were arrested and charged with murder. An additional 160 strikers were arrested on different charges. The committee that had taken control of the town were arrested and charged with treason against the state. In each case, those arrested were acquitted, as the prosecution failed to find any jurors in the area who were not sympathetic with the strikers. The time the labor leaders had spent in jail away from the workers helped speed the demise of the Union. Not all was lost for the laborers. The actions of Homestead did help lead to 26 states outlining the use of private armies, like the Pinkertons, to break strikes. It also caused many to criticize Carnegie for hiding out in Scotland and having Frick do his dirty work. As for the Steelworkers Union, their numbers went into decline for the rest of the 1890s.
So basically, the workers didn't win the battle, but they did leave a mark. It's kind of like losing the game but changing the rules so the other team can't play the same way again. And Carnegie hiding in Scotland while Frick took the heat? Classic. Such a guy thing to do. Start the fire, then disappear while someone else deals with the smoke.
Frick, he made it until 1919 when he passed away at the age of 69. After his release in 1909, Berkman continued his work supporting the labor and anarchy. During World War I, he and Emma Goldman were arrested because of their anti war activities and encouraging people to avoid the draft. It was part of the government's crackdown on anything they viewed as a hindrance to the war effort, including that pesky First Amendment. They were ordered deported under the Anarchist Exclusion Act and sent to Russia. Originally supportive of the Russian Revolution, they, like many, would lose faith in the direction the revolution took and left Russia. At a going away party before their deportation, Berkman learned of the news of Frick's passing. When asked for a comment, he said Frick had been, quote, deported by God.
Wow, that's cold, but also kind of poetic. Deported by God. Berkman really had a way with words. Guess that was the final strike he actually managed to pull off.
After leaving Russia, Goldman and Berkman floated around Europe, living in Germany and France. Berkman died in 1936 in Nice, France. Goldman would travel to Spain to support the nationalists against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. She was later granted temporary residency in Canada, where she died in 1940. Shout out to A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn and the writings of Emma Goldman that were the most informative while writing this episode. This has been History is Criminal. Join us in a week as we look at the kidnapping and murder of Brooke Hart, the golden boy of 1930s San Jose. And as usual, if you like what you heard, tell a friend. And if you didn't, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.